Despite legislative changes and a growing awareness of gay men and women in South Africa, there persists a notion that homosexuality is, quote, un-African. Well, joining us now for more of his insights on the matter is Graeme Reid. Graeme's the author of How to Be a Real Gay, Gay Identities in Small Town South Africa. He's also the director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Rights Program for Human Rights Watch. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I want to just start with the title of your book, and I want to unpack it a little bit. It's called How to Be a Real Gay. So in the South African context, how is gay identity defined?
Well, it varies, and that's where I get the title of the book from, is that there was an activist who spent a lot of time in the city of Johannesburg, but lived in a rural area. And then his sense is that the gays in the rural area didn't know how to be real gays. So he came up with a novel idea of running a series of workshops on teaching people how to be a real gay. And I thought that was really fascinating because it demonstrated how an identity is constructed. And he went about running these workshops, and there was a lot of discussion and debate about what gay meant, different terms, what homosexual meant, what transgender meant. And through that process, people came to an understanding of themselves and their identities that drew on local understandings of gender and sexuality, but were also drawing on a more global understanding around what gender and sexuality meant. And also, because South Africa's constitution protects people on the basis of sexual orientation, there was also that discussion about what it meant to be gay in post-apartheid South Africa, where suddenly there were new freedoms.
I want to ask you about that legal, constitutional context. Walk me through how, not every law, but the laws surrounding homosexuality in South Africa are.
Well, you know, what happened is South Africa went from a point where homosexuality was illegal. It was outlawed in terms of what was called an Immorality Act. And the Immorality Act in South Africa covered a range of different so-called sexual offenses, including homosexuality, interracial sexual relations, a whole gambit of repressive legislation around sexuality. And it went from that point to a constitution that included sexual orientation as a specific category of protection, and in fact was the first country in the world to do so. And so after the constitution was ratified in 1996, there was a process of legal reform to bring all these laws in place and up to the line of the constitution. And so those kinds of laws, the Immorality Act was scrapped, and then a series of legislative changes took place to ensure that there was equality in terms of partnership benefits and all equal rights up to and including marriage equality.
And during the apartheid days, were there gay rights activists fighting against fighting for their rights during that time, or were they quieting down?
You know, it was both, but that's the really fascinating story of South Africa, because some people felt intimidated and were closeted and quiet, and others were very active and visible. But importantly, they were visible within the anti-apartheid movement. So as part of a broader human rights struggle, that there were also visible, prominent LGBT activists within that struggle. Lesbians who were very active in the labor movement, for instance. And one man in particular, by the name of Simon and Cordy, who was arrested and charged with treason. And he was part of one of the very significant treason trials that took place in South Africa and that dragged on for years. And he was also a gay rights activist. And this came out in the court case because his alibi was that he was at a gay meeting, a meeting of a gay organization, at the time that he was accused of participating in this, as part of an opposition movement. So it came up amongst the trialists because some of the trialists felt that they needed to distance themselves from him. They felt that the fact that one of their members was gay would bring their movement into disrepute. But others said, no, we need to support our comrade who's part and parcel of the same struggle. And there was a very rigorous debate about this. And ultimately, what the trialists decided was to stand together and to support Simon and Cordy. And that was a very significant moment because many of those people who were charged with treason at that time went on to become prominent leaders in the post-apartheid South Africa because it was part of the internal leadership of opposition to apartheid. So there's incidents like that that have been very, very significant.
And as we then fast forward, if I can put it that way, to 2015, where human rights are protected in the context of rights for gay and lesbian South Africans within the Constitution. South Africa seems to be an outlier on the continent compared to especially places like Uganda and things like this. What was it with South Africa being able to be so progressive legally, while other countries are just mired in this very unprogressive legal framework even for the laws?
And I think that's directly related to the fact that the anti-apartheid struggle became a very broad-based human rights struggle. And it is strange, actually, that other anti-colonial struggles haven't embraced LGBT rights, but have somehow, in many instances, excluded that from the country and seen it as something un-African as well, which has been is a common refrain that we hear in many parts of the continent.
We'll talk about this term, and I use it in quotes, un-African,
Right.
because that's where it should be. But I want to bring up, so the legal context is one thing, and then there's the social context, which is another. So let's bring up this Pew Research poll. This is from a couple years ago. It looked at public attitudes towards homosexuality in South Africa. So 62% of the population there, their views on homosexual is that morally unacceptable. And then you look at the other, 40, whatever it is, 48%, 38%, if I can add properly, and it breaks down, but not a lot of people are saying, hey, this is morally acceptable, 18%. So how do you then, Graeme, reconcile the legal framework being at odds with public opinion, with societal opinion?
Right. I mean, that's an absolutely critical and important point. And the situation in South Africa is not rosy. There's been a lot of violence, particularly directed at lesbians. In fact, Human Rights Watch published a report a couple of years ago that looked into that problem, addressing some 120 people, interviewing them who'd experienced some form of violence, precisely because they were, in this instance, lesbian. So there are negative public attitudes, and sometimes that also translates into violence. There was an interesting study that was done in South African school systems, which also showed high levels of homophobia, but also, in a more optimistic way, a high level of support for the Constitution and for the principles of equality in the Constitution. So I think that those two things can coexist. The fact that yes, there is still a lot of homophobia within the country, but at the same time, most South Africans embrace and support the underlying principles of the Constitution, which includes the principle of equality, which doesn't mean there's not a lot of work to be done.
All right, you brought up this term, un-African, and I want to play, this is a bit from a debate hosted back in 2010 from the BBC, but in South Africa, on that question, whether or not homosexuality is un-African. Take a look at this.
I am an African. We believe in being remembered for eternity. So the only way to do that is through reproduction. How do I reproduce with another man and claim that I'm an African? It can't be done. I am a Christian. In a biblical point of view, homosexuality is wickedness. The only way for my surname to continue, you see, for my surname to continue is through reproduction.
I stand here as an African person. I cannot allow a conversation to go on insulting me and telling me that I'm not an African. You're actually not even insulting me. You're insulting my ancestors.
That's not what we're saying.
You understand me?
No one has suggested that you are an African. But if you believe in homosexuality, then you are believing in something that is an African.
Okay, Graeme, there's that term, that un-African term. Where does this idea that homosexuality isn't compatible with African history and culture come from, that it is un-African?
And there's another interesting aspect to what David Bahati was saying there, and that is that if you believe in homosexuality as if it's some kind of an ideology, right?
That's the man in the suit that was saying that.
Yes.
You're not, yeah.
Yes. And so, and the irony, of course, is that many of the laws, most of the laws that exist in sub-Saharan Africa are actually relics of British colonialism. And the language of the law is exactly out of British law, the carnal knowledge against the order of nature. And so many people suggest that actually it's homophobia that is an import to Africa rather than homosexuality. And the other debate that's going on there is, what is African? Now, what we've seen over the last 25 years is the emergence of an African gay movement. And so there's more visibility around LGBT people within Africa, and so there's a perception that this is something new and something recent. But of course, same-sex practices have been going on for centuries, and you know, in some societies, in some cultures within sub-Saharan Africa, people who, what we would call now gay, sometimes had a special place within that society, for example, as healers. And you know, there are many documented examples of same-sex practicing people within sub-Saharan Africa, and the mere existence of a vibrant LGBT movement throughout the subcontinent is an African phenomenon. So it seems absurd to decide that one thing is not African and something else is.
And you talk about this debate, this argument that it's connected to colonialism, that people push back. Say they see it as a quote unquote Western import. Do they see it as too Western? Is that part of the pushback?
Well, that's the language in which the pushback is framed. But what we often see, and the spokesperson there who was talking like that is actually from Uganda. He was the man who was behind the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda. And, you know, so what he is trying to, the point that he's trying to make there is that that homosexuality is somehow foreign to Africa, whereas, I mean, patently that is just not the case, right?
All right, let's delve into what you delve into into your book, which is being a gay person in small town in rural South Africa. You did your fieldwork in a place called Ermelo. We'll put it up on a map so we can see where it is. Take me to Ermelo. What's it like?
So I was interested in, like, what was gay life like outside of urban centers and cities, right, in South Africa. At the time, I was interested from an archival point of view. I was centrally involved in the gay and lesbian archives in South Africa, and I was interested in finding out what life was like in smaller towns in rural areas. And so I started doing an investigative research project, basically through a network of people that I'd met through connections in Johannesburg who knew somebody here. So Ermelo is a kind of agricultural mining center in a part of South Africa that is more rural, more kind of small towns, much more conservative than the city centers where I was familiar with the LGBT groups. And so I was interested to know what it was like to be gay or lesbian in that kind of a setting. And I was surprised by the level of acceptance and integration of people in their church communities, and being quite visible in those settings. And so I decided to do a more in-depth study there. And I ended up doing my PhD research in Ermelo, spending a lot of time there over a period of a year, and just really getting to know that community and understanding a little bit more about how people lived in that environment.
Okay, and so let's talk about that. If you're a gay man living in Ermelo, what is life like for you there?
You know, firstly, the people that I first met with were mostly working either as hairstylists or as healers. So it seemed that those were the two kind of career options for a gay male in that setting.
Because that's the only thing that people would accept them doing, or because I was like, what was the reasoning behind that when you looked into it?
Well, that was one of the common kinds of occupations that gay people did. So there were role models of others who worked as hairstylists, and then younger gay people would tend to hang out at the hair salon and learn that trade.
Okay.
And they were quite successful in that trade because it's a highly competitive informal industry, but gay people were seen to be particularly skilled at doing hairstyling, so they had a lot of customers. And so it was also in a situation where there were not that many economic opportunities, it was an obvious thing to pursue. And then the healing was more...
This is like a traditional healer when you say healer? Yeah.
Yes. That is a traditional role that people who are gay could occupy within traditional societies. So that was a recognized role for gay people.
And what about women?
Women, again, one of the occupations was to be healers, but the women were more invisible than the men. So men were much more prominent, much more obvious, and more socially integrated, whereas the women were more discreet and more invisible, actually.
Seems to me, Graeme, that's a bit of a stereotype that gay men are going to cut hair. And I mean, were you surprised when you went in Johannesburg, metropolitan, urban, gay, straight out, people are doing all kinds of things. When you land in Ermelo, are you like, wow, this is a real throwback? What's happening here?
Yes, I think there was that, and also that there were quite strict ideas about gender roles. That also was something that was very interesting to me, and something that didn't occur in the urban metropolitan centers. So that was another thing that seemed to me to be quite distinctive. And people also would adapt their behavior as they moved from the urban metropolitan centers back to the rural area, where there would be more clearer and stricter ideas about gender roles and norms.
And how are gay and lesbian people in Ermelo treated by the broader society?
You know, generally speaking, and that was the thing that I found surprising, is that even though there is quite a high level of homophobic rhetoric or language, so you do hear, even in Ermelo, that homosexuality is un-African and that homosexuality is un-Christian, and yet at the same time, on a community level, people know individuals who are gay, and then somehow that's different because they know that person. So it's less abstract and it's more personal. So, and indeed, some of the stylists were known to be, you know, celebrities in their neighborhoods, in those areas. So there's a paradox of, on the one hand, some quite negative language, and on the other hand, a sense of acceptance. And the other thing that I found very interesting was in some of the church communities, some of the Christian communities, and particularly those that combine traditional religious practice with Christianity, is gay people flocked to those churches, the African independent churches, and were often treated with a high level of respect within those church communities.
All right, there seems to be, from what you're saying, this sort of traditional path career-wise, if you're
Yes.
a gay man in small town South Africa. What if you want to be, or woman, what if you want to be a police officer? How do people look upon that?
Well, it's interesting that you would say that, because with the political transition, working in local government has now opened up as a career option too, because there are non-discrimination policies within government. And so I also noticed that people are, you know, working within government departments increasingly. So
I mean, they don't have to always fit into this stereotype. Society's quite accepting. Is that what you're saying in small town South Africa?
yes, but you know, having said that, people do also experience levels of violence and discrimination as they do elsewhere. But that's not the only story. There's also stories of acceptance, of solidarity, of support.
And so when you talk to these individuals, because on the one hand, you just made this point that, yes, there's acceptance in the broader community to some level, yet you're judged by who you are and your sexuality. So when you were doing your research and talking to people, how did they sort of balance those two things? How did they feel?
Well, you know, I tried to get as closer to a direct experience as I could, and I took rooms in a township in Ermelo called Wesselton, and I stayed in a place that was called the Gay Palace because there were a number of gay people living there. It was very far from being a palace. There was only intermittent running water, and it was quite difficult economic circumstances in which people lived. And they were very visible as gay people within that community. So, you know, pretty brave in terms of the fact that every day in the way in which they presented themselves, it was clear that these were gay men, and they were very
Open about it.
Open about it, yeah.
And do they feel ostracized? Do they feel accepted for the most part, without outside of that sort of safe environment?
Yes, because I mean, it's mixed, right? So there could be some people did experience forms of discrimination and forms of violence, but the landlords who owned the place were a straight couple. Most of the people that I worked with attended mainstream church communities. They went to the local tavern, which was not a gay bar by any stretch of the imagination, but that's where they would socialize. And by and large, people were accepted in those kinds of environments and settings.
And how different is it if you're a white gay man versus a black gay man?
There's still a lot of race politics that exist in the small towns, and Ermelo included. And so one of the things that was very striking to me was the fact that there wasn't much mixing between black gay people and white gay people. There's still quite a strong both racial and economic divide between communities.
What are we to take away from all of this, Graeme, in terms of, we have a legal framework in this country where, based on human rights, great improvements over the last number of years, and then this sort of juxtaposition societally where, yeah, it's accepted, but it's still un-African. How are we to understand gay rights in South Africa within that larger framework?
Well, I think it speaks both to the possibilities and the limits of the law. Is that there is an argument that the Constitution doesn't really impact the lives of people who live more on the margins, people in the rural areas, people who are poor, that what does the Constitution mean? It's just a piece of paper if you can't access it. But what I argue in this book is that's not the case, that the Constitution gives people a sense of belonging, a sense of citizenship, a sense of entitlement, and a sense of pride that really does impact their life possibilities and what they can and can't achieve. At the same time, the law can't do everything. And that's the frustration in South Africa, is that it's going to take a long time to change social attitudes. And there are people within government and civil society who are working to do that, but recognizing that that's a long-term goal. But the law is a significant part of setting the parameters and setting the goal, because the Constitution in many ways, not just on LGBT issues, is seen as an aspirational document, as something that we are striving towards as a society, not as a reflection of where society is now.
And so for gay rights activists, how do they operate within this context to get society to change their attitudes to come more in line with the legal framework of South Africa?
You know, there are a number of initiatives in rural areas. One of the things that activists are doing in rural areas is to be meeting with the police, to say, we are not being treated properly by the police, sensitizing and educating police, meeting with traditional leaders, explaining who they are, so that people have an individual picture of this person or that person, not an abstract idea of this, like homosexuality, as we saw in the clip, this idea that it's some kind of ideology, some kind of foreign ideology. And I think the other thing that we do need to watch for is the way in which homophobia is used politically. not in South Africa, but when we think about what's happened in Uganda and in Nigeria and in Gambia, it's always when there are other social problems, political problems, economic problems, that's when homophobia is used. We can always tell when there's an election looming in Zimbabwe by the high levels of homophobic rhetoric that come from government officials. So it's a way of kind of distracting attention, a kind of useful way of distracting attention from real problems to focus on this imagined threat.
Graeme, thank you for coming in and talking to us about this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.